The letter arrived soaked in blood, and Alfred Boone read it 3 times before he understood what his dying brother was asking of him. It was the autumn of 1874, and the Kansas plains had turned the color of rusted iron, the grasses bending low beneath a wind that carried the first promises of a brutal winter. Alfred had ridden 2 days from Dodge City to reach the small homestead, where his brother Daniel lay stretched across a narrow bed, a fever burning through him like a grass fire. The doctor had come and gone, leaving behind a bottle of laudanum and a look that said everything without saying anything at all. Daniel had been shot during a cattle dispute north of Wichita, and the wound had festered in the way wounds do when a man is too stubborn to rest and too proud to ask for help. Alfred sat beside his brother's bed with his hat in his hands and his heart somewhere in the vicinity of his boots. Daniel was 30 years old and had always been the better-looking of the 2 Boone brothers, with an easy smile and a way of making strangers feel like old friends. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and warmed it simply by being there, and now he lay gray-faced and shaking beneath a wool blanket, looking somehow smaller than Alfred had ever seen him. "Alfred," Daniel said, his voice rough as gravel, "I need you to do something for me." "Anything," Alfred said, and he meant it the way a man only means something when he is staring grief directly in the face. Daniel reached beneath his pillow and pulled out a folded envelope. His hand trembled as he held it out, and Alfred took it carefully, the way you take something fragile and precious. "Her name is Inez Keller," Daniel said. "She was going to be my wife." Alfred opened the envelope and found inside a photograph and 2 letters. The photograph showed a young woman with dark eyes and a serious expression, her hair pinned up beneath a small hat, her chin lifted in a way that suggested she was not accustomed to being looked down upon. She was beautiful in a way that was quiet and strong, not the kind of beauty that announced itself loudly but the kind that settled into a man slowly like sunrise. "Where is she?" Alfred asked. "New Mexico Territory," Daniel said. "Town called Silo Rojo. We wrote letters for a year and a half. I sent for her 2 months ago. She should be making her way there by now, waiting on word from me. She does not know I am dying." He paused to gather his breath, and the effort of it was painful to watch. "She has no family left. Her father died last spring. She sold everything she had to make the journey. Alfred, she is going to arrive in Silo Rojo, and there will be nobody waiting for her. No money, no home, nothing." Alfred stared at the photograph for a long moment. He could see in those dark eyes something that he recognized, a kind of quiet courage that a person develops when life has handed them more than their share of difficulty. "I need you to go to her," Daniel said. "Not to take my place, I am not asking that. Just to explain what happened. To give her the money I set aside." He pressed a leather pouch into Alfred's hands. "There is enough there to get her settled somewhere decent, to give her a start. She deserves a start, Alfred. She is a good woman, better than most." "I will find her," Alfred said. "Promise me." "I promise you, Daniel, I will find Inez Keller." Daniel closed his eyes, and the tension in his face eased somewhat. He died 2 days later on a Tuesday morning, with the sun coming through the window and Alfred sitting right beside him, holding his hand. Alfred buried him in the red earth of the Kansas plains, said the words he knew by heart from a childhood spent in a church-going family, and stood over the grave for a long time afterward with his hat pressed to his chest. Then he went inside, cleaned himself up, packed his saddlebag, and began the long ride south toward New Mexico Territory. Alfred Boone was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that tended to see more than he said out loud. He had spent the past 6 years working cattle drives, earning a reputation as a man who was steady and reliable and not easily rattled. He was not unkind, but he was not what anyone would call warm either, at least not in the way Daniel had been warm. He had built walls around himself the way a man builds walls around a homestead, practical and necessary, meant to keep the weather out. He did not think of himself as the kind of man who fell in love. He thought of himself as the kind of man who kept promises. The ride from Kansas to New Mexico Territory in the fall of 1874 was not a simple undertaking. Alfred rode his roan mare, a solid horse he called Georgia, and covered ground steadily, stopping at small towns and trading posts to water her and to gather what information he could about the route ahead. The land changed as he rode south, the flat plains giving way to rougher, more dramatic country, the earth turning redder, the sky growing wider, the air taking on a dry quality that was different from anything Kansas could offer. He passed through small settlements where life was hard and people were guarded. He stopped one evening at a relay station run by a taciturn man named Grover who sold him a meal of salt pork and cornbread, and told him the road south had been troubled lately by a band of outlaws working the stretch between the Oklahoma border and the New Mexico line. "You armed?" Grover asked, eyeing him across the table. "Well enough," Alfred said. He carried a Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard and a Colt revolver on his hip, which was the practical minimum for a man riding alone through unsettled country. He was not looking for trouble, but he was not unprepared for it either. He rode for 4 days through the territory before reaching the New Mexico line, sleeping under the open sky when there was no shelter to be had, wrapped in his bedroll with Georgia hobbled nearby, and the stars spread above him like salt on black velvet. The nights were cold now, October having arrived with authority, and he lay awake sometimes in the dark thinking about Daniel. He missed his brother in a way that felt physical, like a missing tooth that his tongue kept finding. He and Daniel had not always been close. The years of cattle work had scattered them, but the bones of their brotherhood were deep and old, and losing Daniel meant losing the only person in the world who remembered him as a boy. He thought about Inez Keller, too, on those long, cold nights. He looked at her photograph by firelight and wondered what she was like beyond the serious expression and the lifted chin. He wondered if she was already in Silo Rojo, waiting for a man who would never come. He wondered how she would take the news. He had never been good at delivering grief. He arrived in the town of Mesquite Wells, a dusty collection of adobe and timber buildings strung along a single main street, and stopped at the general store to resupply. It was here that he first heard her name spoken aloud by someone other than himself. The woman behind the counter, a broad-faced woman with efficient hands and sharp eyes, was talking to another customer when Alfred came through the door. He caught only the tail end of the conversation, but he heard the name clearly. "Inez Keller, she has been staying at the boarding house 3 days now. Waiting on someone from Kansas, I believe. Poor thing looks anxious as a cat in a rainstorm." Alfred set down the goods he had gathered and looked at the woman. "Excuse me," he said. "Did you say Inez Keller?" The woman behind the counter turned and looked at him with the frank assessment that women in small frontier towns tend to apply to strangers. "I did," she said. "You know her?" "I am looking for her," Alfred said, on behalf of someone she was expecting. The woman's eyes went a little guarded. "She is at Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house, end of the main street, white door. But I will tell you plain, mister, if you are here to make trouble for that girl, there are enough people in this town who like her already that you will not enjoy the consequences." Alfred appreciated the woman's directness. "I am not here to make trouble," he said. "I bring news she needs to hear, news that is not good." The woman behind the counter looked at him for a long moment and then nodded, something shifting in her expression towards sympathy. "Then you had better go gently," she said. "She seems like a woman who has already had plenty of hard news in her life." He thanked her, paid for his supplies, and rode Georgia to the stable at the far end of town, where he paid a boy to water and feed her. Then he walked the length of Mesquite Wells' single main street to Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step, his hat pulled low against an afternoon sun that was still warm despite the season. He stood outside the white door for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He was not a man who hesitated, as a rule, but he felt the weight of what he was about to do sitting heavily on him. He was going to walk through that door and dismantle the future of a woman he had never met. He was going to tell her that the life she had planned, the husband she had corresponded with for a year and a half, the new beginning she had given everything to reach, was gone. He raised his hand and knocked. The door opened, and Inez Keller was standing in front of him, and the photograph had not done her justice. She was perhaps 24 years old, with dark brown hair and eyes the color of strong coffee, eyes that were intelligent and alert, and currently regarding him with a mixture of wariness and hope that was almost painful to see. She was not tall, coming up to perhaps his chin, but she had a quality of presence that made the doorway feel fully occupied. She wore a simple dark dress, practical and neat, and her hands, he noticed, were still and composed in the way that a person's hands are when they are exercising deliberate control. "Yes," she said. Alfred took off his hat. "Miss Keller," he said, "my name is Alfred Boone. I am Daniel's brother. May I come in?" Something moved through her eyes then, swift and complex, a flicker of hope and fear arriving simultaneously. She looked at him for a moment that stretched. Then she stepped back and held the door open. The sitting room of Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house was small and clean, furnished with a horsehair settee and 2 wooden chairs and a braided rug of no particular color. Afternoon light came through a single window. Mrs. Hennessy herself, a small energetic widow of about 60, appeared from somewhere at the back and offered tea, and Alfred accepted because it gave him something to do with his hands and a little more time to find the words. But when Mrs. Hennessy had gone to fetch it and they were momentarily alone, Inez Keller looked at him directly and said, "He is dead, is not he?" Alfred met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "He passed 10 days ago, a fever from a wound that did not heal properly. He did not suffer at the end. The last part was not entirely true, but it was the kind of thing you said because it was the kind thing to say, and he believed Daniel would have wanted her to hear it." Inez Keller sat down in one of the wooden chairs with a deliberate, careful movement, as though she were setting down something very heavy. She pressed her hands flat against her knees and looked at the window, and Alfred watched her face go through several things at once, grief and something that looked almost like a grim recognition, as though part of her had already known and had been bracing for this moment. She did not cry. Not then. She sat with her grief in a way that was so contained and dignified that Alfred found himself deeply moved by it. Mrs. Hennessy returned with the tea, glanced between the two of them with the perceptiveness of a woman who had seen a great deal of life, set the tray down quietly and withdrew without being asked. "He spoke of you," Alfred said when the silence had stretched to its limit. "At the end, he made me promise to find you." "What did he say?" she asked, still looking at the window. "He said you were a good woman, better than most." Alfred paused. "He said you had no family left, and he did not want you to arrive somewhere with nobody waiting and no means. He set aside money for you. He placed the leather pouch on the table between them. He wanted you to have a proper start." Inez looked at the pouch but did not touch it. Then she turned her eyes to Alfred, and he saw in them not self-pity but something steelier, a woman taking stock of her circumstances and deciding what to do next. "I sold my father's farm," she said. "I have $32 left in a trunk of belongings and a ticket that has already been used. I have been in this town for 3 days wondering why there was no telegram from Daniel and telling myself there was a simple explanation." She paused. "There was not a simple explanation." "No," Alfred said. "I am sorry. You rode all this way to tell me," she said. "It was not a question. I made a promise to my brother." She looked at him steadily. There was something in the quality of her attention that was unusual. She was not looking at him the way people usually looked at someone, scanning the surface. She was looking at him as though she were reading something. "You loved him," she said. "He was my brother," Alfred said, as though that explained everything, which he supposed it did. Inez Keller nodded slowly. Then she picked up her teacup and held it with both hands, and Alfred noticed that her hands were not entirely steady now, but she held on. He stayed in Mesquite Wells that night, taking a room at the boarding house himself because it was late and Georgia needed rest, and he felt, with a certainty he could not entirely explain, that it was not right to simply deliver the news and ride away. He had breakfast the next morning in the small dining room off the kitchen, and Inez came down at the same hour, and they sat across from each other at the narrow table while Mrs. Hennessy brought eggs and biscuits and strong coffee. Inez asked him about Daniel. She asked careful, specific questions. What had he been like in person? Had he been happy? Had he suffered at the end? Was he buried properly? Alfred answered each question as honestly and as fully as he could, and as he answered, he found himself actually talking about his brother in a way he had not been able to do with anyone, talking about Daniel's easy laugh and his infuriating optimism, and the way he had of making every person he met feel as though they were the most interesting person in the room. Inez listened to all of it with a focused and genuine attention, and at the end she said, "He wrote letters that made me feel that way. As though I were the most interesting person in the room. That was Daniel all over," Alfred said. "I think I would have loved him," she said simply, and there was a cleanness to her grief that Alfred found remarkable. No performance, no dramatizing, just an honest woman telling an honest truth. He asked her what she intended to do now, and she was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "There is not much to go back to," she said. "The farm is sold. I had an aunt in Ohio, but she passed 2 years ago. I suppose I need to find a town where a woman with my skills can find decent work." "What skills?" he asked. "I can teach school. I taught the younger children in my county for 2 years before my father's health required me to come home. I can sew tolerably well and I can keep books. My father was a merchant before he turned to farming and he taught me his accounts." Alfred thought about this. Silo Road, the town where Daniel had been heading, was about a day and a half's ride further south. He had been planning to go there anyway to settle some of Daniel's affairs, a small parcel of land Daniel had put a down payment on, a contract that would need to be dealt with. "The town your tickets were made out for," he said. "Silo Road. I need to go there anyway to see to some of Daniel's business matters. If you are willing to make the journey, it is a growing town. They might well have need of a school teacher." Inez looked at him across the table. The morning light was coming through the window behind her, catching in her dark hair. "You would accompany me," she said. "It is on my route," he said, which was true and also not the whole truth, and something in her expression told him she was aware of both. "That is very practical of you, Mr. Boone," she said, with the smallest suggestion of a dry smile at the corner of her mouth. "I am a practical man," he said. They left Mesquite Wells the following morning, Inez riding a hired horse, a steady bay mare, with her trunk strapped to the back of a small wagon that Alfred had arranged to hire from a man in town who was going as far as the Paloma Creek Junction anyway, and was glad of the company for part of the journey. The man's name was Ernesto Vega, a Mexican rancher of about 50 with a magnificent mustache and a philosophical disposition, and he and Alfred rode side by side at the front of the wagon, while Inez sat in the wagon bed on her trunk. But she did not sit passively. She was constantly observing the landscape around them with an attention that suggested she was the kind of person who filed information away for later use. The land they rode through was magnificent in the way that only difficult places can be magnificent. Red rock formations rising from the desert floor like the ruins of something ancient, cottonwood trees blazing yellow along the creek beds, the sky above them an impossible shade of blue, the air so clean it felt like it cleaned you out from the inside. Ernesto Vega told them stories as they rode, stories about the old Spanish land grants and the way the territory had changed since the Mexican-American War. Stories about families who had been here for 200 years and now found themselves suddenly citizens of a country that regarded them with suspicion. He told these stories without bitterness, but with a clear-eyed honesty that Alfred respected, and he noticed that Inez leaned forward to listen, asking questions that showed she was actually thinking about what he was telling her rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. They stopped at midday near a creek, where the cottonwoods provided shade, and ate the food Mrs. Hennessy had pressed on them when they left cold biscuits and hard cheese and dried fruit. Alfred tended to the horses while Inez unpacked the food, and Ernesto sat on a rock and smoked a thin cigar with the contentment of a man who had made peace with the world. "You two are not a couple," Ernesto observed, looking between them with amiable directness. "No," Inez said, without apparent discomfort. Said Ernesto, as though he had reached a different conclusion that he was keeping to himself for the moment. Alfred was very interested in his horse's water bucket for the next few minutes. They made good time that day and camped at evening near a stand of juniper trees, building a fire and making a simple camp, Alfred sleeping on the ground with his saddle for a pillow and Inez sleeping in the wagon bed, wrapped in her traveling blankets. Ernesto snored with extraordinary enthusiasm about 6 feet away. Alfred lay on his back and looked at the stars, which were unreasonably spectacular out here in the high desert where there was no town light to dilute them. He thought about the fact that Inez Keller was sleeping 12 feet away from him, and he was thinking about her with a frequency and specificity that was becoming difficult to ignore. She was not what he had expected, though he was not sure what he had expected. He had expected grief, and she had that. He had expected someone fragile, and she was not that at all. He had expected someone passive, a woman who had been waiting to be claimed like a piece of mail, and what he had found was a woman who was actively navigating her own life with intelligence and courage and a dry humor that had surprised him completely. He was also, if he was being honest with himself under those ridiculous stars, struck by her in a way that was considerably more than intellectual appreciation. He noticed her the way a man notices a woman when something in him has recognized something in her, and the noticing felt dangerous and inconvenient and entirely outside his intentions. He told himself firmly that she was his dead brother's intended. He told himself that she was grieving. He told himself that he was here to honor a promise, not to pursue his own inclinations. He told himself all of these things and believed all of them, and then he went to sleep and dreamed of dark eyes and a lifted chin, and there was nothing he could do about that. On the second day, Ernesto left them at the Paloma Creek Junction, taking his wagon south toward his own ranch, and Alfred and Inez continued west on horseback, the hired bay mare carrying Inez with comfortable steadiness while Alfred rode Georgia beside her. The road to Silo Rojo wound through increasingly dramatic landscape, red canyon walls rising on either side in places, the sky visible in a strip above like a ribbon of blue silk. They talked as they rode, the way people talk when they have been traveling together long enough that the initial wariness has worn thin, and conversation becomes the natural thing. She told him about her father, a German immigrant who had come to Ohio as a young man and built a merchant's business from nothing, who had taught her to read accounts and to think clearly about money, and to believe that a woman's mind was as capable as any man's and should be treated accordingly. She told him about the farm years, after her father gave up the merchant trade, the hard, satisfying work of it, the way she had liked the clarity of farming, the direct relationship between effort and result. He told her about the cattle drives, years of them, up the Kishom Trail and the Western Trail, sleeping under the sky and eating bad food and working 18-hour days in weather that ran the full range from brutal to merely unpleasant. He told her about it without romance, the way a man who has actually done something speaks about it differently from a man who has only imagined it, and she listened with the focused attention she gave to everything. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "The cattle drives." "Daniel settled down," Alfred said, "or was starting to. I suppose I thought it was time to think about that myself." He paused. "I had not quite figured out what that meant when all this happened." Inez was quiet for a moment. "Daniel told me in his letters that you were very capable," she said. "He said you could do anything you put your mind to, but that you had not yet put your mind to the right thing." Alfred glanced at her sideways. "That sounds exactly like something Daniel would say." "He was fond of you," she said simply. The fondness was very clear in his letters, even when he was being slightly exasperated by you. Alfred felt the grief move through him again, sudden and sharp like a cramp. He breathed through it. He was fond of everyone, he said. That was his particular gift. They were quiet for a little while after that, the horse's hooves on the dry ground the only sound, and a hawk circling high above the canyon walls, and the wind moving through the sparse desert vegetation. Somewhere in that comfortable silence, Alfred became aware of the fact that he was happy. It was a strange and unexpected realization, to be happy in the middle of grief and obligation, but there it was. The riding and the sky and the conversation and the particular company of this particular woman were producing in him a sensation of well-being that he recognized, distantly, as happiness. He regarded it with some suspicion. They arrived in Silo Rojo on the afternoon of the third day from Mesquite Wells. The town was larger than Alfred had expected, which was a good sign. It had two main streets crossing each other, a proper hotel and two saloons and a church and a school that sat at the east end of town, a modest adobe building with a wooden cross above the door. There was a land office and a bank and a general store and a blacksmith and a stage depot, the bones of a town that intended to last. Alfred took them to the hotel first, where he paid for 2 rooms, ignoring Inez's expression when he did so, and then he went to the land office to deal with Daniel's affairs. This took the better part of 2 hours and involved some careful paperwork. Daniel's small parcel of land was transferred back to the land office, and the down payment, minus a modest administrative fee that Alfred negotiated down from immodest, was refunded. He added this amount to the leather pouch and brought it back to Inez. "This is all Daniel's," he said. "The original amount he set aside for you, plus what came back from the land." Inez looked at the pouch. "That is a considerable sum," she said. "He saved carefully," Alfred said. "He was always better with money than I was." She picked up the pouch and held it for a moment. Then she set it on the table. "I will need to find work," she said. "I will not spend this on simply living if I can help it. It should be a foundation, not a ceiling." "The school," Alfred said. "The building is there. Someone must be teaching in it, or it is waiting for someone worth asking." She looked at him with that expression she had, the one where she was reading something. "You have been thinking about this," she said. "Some," he admitted. The town of Silo Rojo was growing rapidly, as many New Mexico Territory towns were in the mid-1870s. As ranching expanded and settlers arrived, and the railroad's approaching presence began to be felt in the economic patterns of the region. It turned out that the school had been without a permanent teacher since spring, the previous teacher having married a rancher and moved to his property 30 miles out. The children of the town's families, Mexican and American alike, were currently receiving intermittent instruction from a rotating arrangement of whoever happened to be available, which was a far cry from satisfactory. The town's mayor, a businesslike man named Harlan Price, sat across from Inez in his office the following morning and listened to her qualifications with close attention. Alfred sat in the chair beside her, having accompanied her because she had asked him to and because the opportunity to be useful felt like the right way to be. He noticed that Inez presented herself without apology and without false modesty, laying out her experience and her credentials clearly, and that Price responded to her directness with visible respect. "The pay is $30 a month," Price said, "plus the use of the teacher's house, a small property attached to the school. It is modest but suitable for a single woman." "I accept," Inez said, and just like that she had a position and a home in Silo Rojo. They celebrated that evening with a meal at the hotel dining room, a real meal with actual plates and candles on the table, and Inez wore a different dress than the traveling one, something in a deep green that Alfred noticed without appearing to notice, and they drank a glass of wine apiece and talked about things that had nothing to do with grief or obligation. She asked him about his own plans, now that Daniel's affairs were settled. He had not fully thought it through, he said, with a frankness that surprised him. He had been so focused on getting here that he had not much considered what came after here. "You could stay," she said, and then appeared to surprise herself with the words. She picked up her wine glass and took a small, composed sip. "The town appears to be growing. There must be work of various kinds." Alfred looked at her across the candlelit table and felt the thing he had been not feeling for 3 days assert itself with considerable authority. "There might be," he said carefully. Inez set her wine glass down and looked at him with an expression that was measured but not closed. "I am aware that this is a very unusual situation," she said. "I want to say something honestly, if I may." "Please," he said. "I grieve Daniel," she said. "I think I will grieve him for some time, though perhaps not in the way one grieves a husband, since we had not yet met. I grieve the possibility of him, if that makes any sense. The man in the letters who was very good and very kind." She paused. "But I am also a practical woman, and I am in a new town with no connections, and I have found that over these past days your company has been—" She seemed to search for the precise word. "Steadying," she settled on. "Steadying," Alfred repeated. "It is a very good thing to be, in my experience," she said, and there was that small suggestion of dry humor at the corner of her mouth again, the one that had surprised him the first time he saw it. Alfred was quiet for a moment. "I find your company fairly steadying myself," he said, and the understatement of it was deliberate, and she caught it, and the small smile widened fractionally. He did not leave Silo Rojo the next day, or the day after that. He told himself he was staying to make sure she was settled, which was partly true. He found himself a room to rent from a widow named Mrs. Calderon on the east side of town and looked for work, which in a growing cattle town was not difficult to find. He was hired by the local rancher, a man named Theodore Cass, who ran cattle on a significant spread north of town, as a general hand with the particular value of his cattle drive experience. He had, without quite deciding to do so, stayed. Inez began teaching the school the following Monday. Alfred saw her that weekend, walking through town with her basket, shopping at the general store, and she stopped to tell him about the school and the children, 22 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 14, a mixture of Anglo and Mexican children whose parents had in common only the ambition to give their children something better. She told him about the children with a warmth and animation that he had not yet seen in her, her eyes bright, her hands moving slightly as she described this particular child's mathematical ability and that particular child's determined slowness with letters that she was determined to turn around. "You like it," he said, slightly wondering. "I love it," she said simply. "Children are completely honest. They make you earn their trust and then they give it to you completely. There is nothing else quite like it." He walked her home from the store, carrying her basket because it was heavy and because he wanted to, and they stood outside the small teacher's house attached to the school for a while, talking, and he did not want to stop talking. That was the truth of it, the plain and increasingly undeniable truth. He did not want to stop being near her. When she went inside and he walked back through town to Mrs. Calderon's, the evening felt distinctly less interesting than it had when she was in it. He wrote a letter to Daniel's grave that night, in his head, the way you have conversations with the dead when you need to think something through. He told his brother what he was feeling and asked whether it was wrong. He thought about Daniel's voice and tried to imagine what he would say. What he came up with, in the architecture of his own memory and understanding of his brother, was that Daniel would laugh, that he would say something characteristically generous and slightly maddening, something like, "Alfred, you idiot, why do you think I asked you specifically to find her?" Alfred lay in his narrow, rented bed and stared at the ceiling and thought that was probably not a straightforward gift from his dead brother. That was his own mind constructing permission for itself. He thought about it for a while, and then thought that probably, Daniel being Daniel, it was both. November came to Silo Rojo with cold mornings and brilliant afternoons, the light on the red rock country being a particular kind of golden that Alfred had never seen anywhere else. He settled into the rhythms of the ranch work, which he liked for its clarity and physical satisfaction, and his evenings were often spent in town. He and Inez fell into a habit, without either of them deciding to, of Sunday suppers. She would cook at the teacher's house, which had a small but functional kitchen, and he would bring whatever he could contribute: a piece of meat from the ranch, a bottle of something from the general store, and they would eat together and talk for hours. She told him about her childhood, the German Christmas traditions her father had brought from the old country and maintained faithfully in Ohio, the elaborate meals and the singing. She told him about the books she had read, working through the small library at her county school with systematic determination, and the ones she had ordered through the mail from back east, carefully saved for in the margins of the household accounts. She had opinions about everything she had read, firm and well-reasoned opinions delivered without aggression but without apology. And Alfred discovered that he had opinions too, that had simply never had occasion to be spoken before. He told her about the cattle trails in ways he had not told her before, not just the hard physical facts of them, but the particular beauty of certain moments, the way a herd looked moving across a plain at dawn, the absolute clarity of the stars from the middle of the open grass sea, the strange camaraderie of men who lived in close company through difficulty. He had never put words to any of this before and found that the words, once started, came more easily than he would have expected. She listened the way she always listened, with full attention, and she asked good questions, questions that showed she was following not just the surface of what he said but the deeper shape of it. He acknowledged to himself sometime in the middle of November, deeply in love with Inez Keller. He had not planned it and he had not wanted to complicate things, and he had told himself considerable numbers of reasons why it was inappropriate. But the love had arrived anyway, the way weather arrives, unstoppable and comprehensive. The question was what to do about it. He thought for a while that the answer was nothing. She was still grieving, or at least still processing. The situation had a complexity to it that made straightforward declaration feel like the wrong instrument. He resolved to be patient, which was not his strongest suit, but which he could manage if required. But then something happened that rearranged his careful plans. It was a Saturday in late November, and the weather had turned sharp, the first real freeze of the season making the air brittle and the ground hard underfoot. Alfred had come to town for supplies and stopped at the school because the light was on and the door slightly open, which seemed wrong for the cold. He pushed the door open and found Inez sitting at her desk in the empty schoolroom, a letter in her hands and her face composed in the particular way it went composed when she was handling something difficult. She looked up when he came in and the composure slipped slightly, just at the edges. "What is it?" he said. "A letter from a cousin I had forgotten," she said. "In Philadelphia. He heard somehow that I had sold the farm and come west. He is offering me a position in his household as a governess to his children, with board and salary." Paused. "He is being kind, I think. He is a decent man. I met him twice as a child." Alfred stood in the doorway of the cold schoolroom and felt the bottom drop out of something in him. "Are you considering it?" She looked at him for a moment. "I do not know," she said honestly. "A month ago I would have said yes without much hesitation. Security and a family connection and a city with libraries and theaters and everything that I imagined I had given up." She set the letter on the desk. "Now I am less certain." He took off his hat and held it, which was what he always did when he needed to think. And he looked at her sitting in the thin winter light of the schoolroom with her dark eyes and her honest face. And he thought about patience, and about wrong instruments, and about the fact that sometimes a man who waits too long simply watches something he needed walk out of his reach. He crossed the room and sat down in one of the student chairs across from her desk, which was somewhat too small for him and probably looked slightly absurd, but he sat in it anyway because he needed to be at her level, not standing over her. "Inez," he said. She looked at him with her full attention. "I need to tell you something that you may not want to hear," he said, "and if it changes things between us or makes you uncomfortable, I will respect that entirely. but I would rather say it and have you know than not say it and spend however long wondering what would have happened." She was very still. "I came here to honor a promise to my brother," he said. "That is true, and it remains true, and I do not regret a single hour of it. But somewhere between Kansas and this schoolroom I have fallen in love with you. Not as a replacement for Daniel's feeling, not as something I set out to do, just as a plain fact that arrived whether I invited it or not." He held her gaze steadily. "You do not have to say anything. You do not have to feel the same way. I just wanted you to know before you decided about Philadelphia, because it seemed like the kind of information a person should have when they are deciding something." Inez Keller sat across from him in the schoolroom she had been teaching for 6 weeks, and she looked at him for a long time. Alfred held very still and did not look away. "Alfred," she said finally, and his name in her voice had a quality he had not heard before. "I have been telling myself since the 3rd day on the road that what I was feeling was gratitude. That it was simply the response of a woman in a difficult situation to a man who was kind and reliable." He waited. "I have been a fairly dishonest historian of my own feelings," she said, and there was a wryness in it that was characteristic of her, the humor arriving alongside the honest thing. "What I have been feeling is not gratitude, or not only gratitude." He felt something move through him, warm and enormous. "This is very fast," she said, and she was not dismissing the thing, only naming it accurately. "And strange, and complicated. We arrived here together because of your brother who I was going to marry. There is a great deal of complexity in this situation." "Yes," he said. "There is. But I am not going to Philadelphia," she said. He exhaled. "I am not going to Philadelphia," she said again, more firmly, as though she had needed to say it twice to feel sure of it. "I like my school and I like my life here and she stopped, started again. "I would like to see what this is," she said. "If that makes any sense. I would like not to make any large pronouncements about things that are still finding their shape. But I would like," she looked at him directly, "I would like to keep having Sunday suppers." He felt the corners of his mouth move. "I would like that too," he said. She stood up from her desk and he stood up from the undersized chair, and they stood across from each other in the schoolroom. And Alfred thought she had never looked more beautiful than she did right now, in this moment, with the honesty of what had just been said still hanging in the cold air between them. He did not kiss her. It was not the right moment for that, and he knew it instinctively. The moment required something more like a handshake of equals, an acknowledgement. He held out his hand and she looked at it for a moment with surprise and then a slow smile. Not the small suggestion of a smile he was accustomed to, but an actual smile, wide and real and transforming her face completely. And she took his hand and they shook, solemnly and with great dignity, and then both of them started laughing. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, really laugh, and it was one of the finest things he had ever heard. December settled over Silo Rojo like a thick blanket, cold and still. Alfred continued his work at the Cass Ranch during the week and spent his evenings and weekends in town, and the Sunday suppers became the thing he organized his weeks around, the bright fixed point that the rest of the days revolved toward. They had not kissed yet, and he was not impatient about it, which surprised him, because patience was not, as established, his natural state. But with Inez everything seemed to find its own right timing, as though the relationship itself knew something about what it needed. The courtship, for that was what it was becoming, had a quality of rightness to it that he had never experienced with anyone before. There had been women in his life, over the cattle drive years, women in towns along the various trails, and some of those relationships had been warm and real, but none of them had ever felt like this, like finding a missing piece of something he had not known was incomplete. They went for walks in the afternoons when the weather allowed, out along the edge of town, where the desert opened up into those extraordinary vistas of red and gold and blue that Alfred had been drawn to since his first ride into the territory. Inez had quickly developed the same love for the landscape, the way it was grand without being gentle, the way it demanded something from you, respect or attention or simply the willingness to feel small. She told him about the children in her school with increasing detail, the small dramas and discoveries of it. A boy named Louis who had been refusing to engage with reading, until she found that he was fascinated by the natural world and began bringing him materials about animals and plants, whereupon he read everything she could find. A girl named Martha who was mathematically brilliant but embarrassed about it because some of the older boys teased her, and the slow, careful work of building her confidence to own her ability. Inez talked about all of this with such love and investment that Alfred sometimes thought she had found something here that she had been looking for without quite knowing it, a place where her particular gifts could do real and lasting work. He mentioned this to her one evening over supper, tentatively, not wanting to presume, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Yes, I think that might be right, and then, I think you might be seeing me quite clearly, Alfred Boone." "I am trying," he said. She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, just her fingers across his knuckles, and then withdrew it and went on eating. And Alfred looked at his plate and felt that small, specific touch radiating warmth all the way up his arm. It was 2 weeks before Christmas when he kissed her, and it happened very naturally, the way things happen when they have been building toward themselves for long enough. They had been standing outside the teacher's house after a Sunday supper, looking up at the stars, which were spectacular in the cold, clear air, and he had been telling her the names of the constellations that the cattle drive cowboys had taught him, the practical ones they used for navigation mixed in with the more lyrical ones from the old books. She had turned to look at him as he was speaking, which he noticed because he could feel her attention shift, and when he turned to look back at her they were very close, and the things in her face were things he recognized because they were in him too, and he leaned down and kissed her very gently, and she was still for just a moment, and then she kissed him back with a quiet certainty that made his heart do something architectural, a complete structural rearrangement. When they separated, she put her hand against his chest briefly, feeling his heartbeat, and looked up at him with an expression that was new, open in a way that he had not seen from her before, the careful composure laid down like a coat she had decided she did not need any more. "Good night, Alfred," she said. "Good night, Inez," he said. He walked back to Mrs. Calderon's through the cold, dark streets of Silo Rojo, feeling entirely too large for his own body. Christmas came to the town with the school children's production of a nativity play that Inez organized with magnificent efficiency, corralling 22 children into something approximating theatrical discipline through a combination of genuine warmth and a firmness that Alfred observed with considerable respect. He attended the production with the other townspeople in the school building, sitting in the cold room warmed by pressive bodies, and watched Inez manage her charges from the side of the room, with the quiet pride of someone watching a person they love do something they were built for. He had Theodore Cass and his wife over for the observation about Inez's teaching, because Cass had children of school age and was, Alfred had found, a man interested in the welfare of the community. Cass was a big, straightforward man with a broad ranch wife named Helen who had opinions about everything and delivered them pleasantly without much concern for whether they were wanted. Helen Cass had taken to Inez immediately, with the instinctive solidarity of women who recognize quality in each other, and Inez and Helen had formed a friendship that Alfred was glad to see because Inez needed a friend in the town, someone beside himself. It was Helen who organized the Christmas gathering at her and Theodore's ranch house, a party of about 30 people from the town and surrounding ranches, and it was here that Alfred danced with Inez for the first time. A fiddler played and the furniture was pushed back in the large main room, and people danced the simple country dances of the era, and Alfred, who had danced approximately never, managed it sufficiently that Inez did not lose any toes and laughed at him only twice, which he considered a reasonable outcome. She was light on her feet and moved with a natural grace, and dancing with her, even with his considerable deficiencies in that area, had a warmth and closeness to it that he did not want to end. He kept her for 3 dances in a row and then surrendered her to other partners because it would have been impolite not to, and spent those dances talking to Theodore Cass about cattle and watching Inez across the room, bright-eyed and alive in a way that filled him with a happiness so substantial it was almost alarming. January of 1875 came in hard and cold, and Alfred spent more time at the ranch as the winter work demanded. He did not see Inez every day, and the days he did not see her had a gray quality to them that the ones he did see her did not have. He was aware that this was thoroughly sentimental and would have been embarrassing to admit to anyone who knew him from the cattle drive years, where he had maintained a reputation for stoic practicality. He was also aware that he needed to make a decision. He had been working for Cass on a day rate, with no long-term arrangement, and the ambiguity of that was beginning to feel uncomfortable. He had saved money over the cattle drive years, not lavishly but steadily, and he had the refunded portion of Daniel's land purchase added to that, which he had put aside separately and thought of as Daniel's money, seed money for something that should be good. One evening in late January, he went to the land office and spent an hour with the clerk looking at what was available in the area. There was a parcel of land about 6 miles north of town, along a creek that ran reliably and had good grass, that had come available when the previous holder, a homesteader who had underestimated the difficulty of desert farming, had given up and moved back east. The price was fair and the land was solid. He spent a week thinking about it. Then he bought it. He told Inez about it on their next Sunday supper. He told her straightforwardly, without dressing it up, that he had bought land north of town and intended to run cattle on it and to build something there. She listened with the attention she always gave him, and when he was done, she asked several practical and intelligent questions about the water situation and the quality of the grass and his financing, which he answered as fully as he could. Then she said, "So you are staying?" "I am staying," he said. She looked at him across the table with the level gaze that he had come to understand meant she was looking at something real, not performing for it. "I am glad," she said simply. "Inez," he said and stopped. She waited. He had been trying to find the words for several weeks now. The feeling was not the problem. The feeling was the largest and most certain thing in him, steady and warm and absolutely sure of itself, in the way that he had been told love was supposed to be and had not, until now, believed. The words were the challenge because they needed to be the right ones, not too small for what he meant, and not so large that they frightened the thing he was trying to say. "I would like to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that there is no right answer you owe me. Whatever you answer is the right answer and I will respect it absolutely." She had gone very still in the way she went still when something significant was arriving. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because it is practical, though it may also be that. Not because of any obligation I had or have to Daniel's memory, because this is nothing to do with Daniel. This is entirely to do with you and me and what has happened between us over these months that I did not plan and cannot imagine not having happened." He held her gaze. "I love you, Inez. I love who you are specifically, not in some general direction but precisely, the way you think and the way you are honest and the way you talk about your children at school and the way you laugh when you actually laugh, which you do not do nearly often enough. I would like to spend the rest of my life knowing what you think about everything and occasionally making you laugh." Inez Keller sat across from him in the small kitchen of the teacher's house and looked at him for a moment that had enormous size for something that occupied so little actual time. Then she said, "Alfred Boone, I have been in love with you since somewhere around the 2nd day on the road to Silo Rojo, and I have been telling myself a great many reasonable and practical things about it since then, and I am tired of reasonable and practical things." She took a breath. "Yes, my answer is yes." He stood up and came around the table and she stood up too, and he put his arms around her, and she put her arms around him, and they stood like that in the warm kitchen for a long moment, not kissing yet, just holding on. And he felt her breathe and felt his own breathing slow to match hers, and thought that this was what home felt like. Not a place, but a person, a specific and particular person. Then she turned her face up, and he kissed her properly, with everything behind it, and she kissed him back with the same everything. And outside the window of the teacher's house, the stars were doing their reliable and spectacular thing above the New Mexico territory. And Alfred Boone was, without question, the most fortunate man in the entire West. They were married in March of 1875 in the small church at the west end of Silo Road. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend, a patient Congregationalist minister named Ambrose Freely, who had a fine speaking voice and an ability to make the liturgical language feel personal and present. The church was full because they had, between the two of them, accumulated a genuine community in the months since Inez had arrived, and everyone from Theodore and Helen Cass to Ernesto Vega, who had ridden 3 days to be there, to the 22 children of the school and their families, was present. Inez wore a dress she had made herself from a pale ivory fabric she had ordered from a catalog back east, and she was so beautiful in it that Alfred, who was a man not generally given to unsteadiness, had to take a very deliberate breath when she came through the church doors. He was standing at the front with Reverend Freely, and he watched her walk toward him and thought very clearly, in the particular silence of a moment that wants to be remembered, "This is the moment. This is the one." She reached him and took his hand, and they faced each other. And in her eyes he saw the thing he had been seeing for months now, steady and warm and entirely his. And he knew with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has finally found the thing he did not know he was looking for, that this was right, that this was what had always been meant to happen, that the long promise to a dying brother had led somewhere his dying brother would have recognized with gladness. The Reverend spoke the words. Alfred spoke his. Inez spoke hers in a clear voice that did not waver, with the lifted chin that had been his first impression of her, and that he had come to understand was not pride but courage, a person insisting on their dignity in whatever circumstance, and he loved it as specifically as he loved everything else about her. They were married. The spring and summer of 1875 were the best months of Alfred's life to date, and he had had some good months in his time. He worked the land north of town with a steady energy that had a different quality now from the cattle drive work, because this work was building something that was his and hers, a future with a shape and a direction. He had begun with a modest herd, 12 cattle bought with careful research and selection from Cass and a neighboring rancher, and he was adding to it slowly, sensibly. He built a house on the property. Not large but solid adobe walls that were warm in winter and cool in summer, 2 main rooms and a kitchen and a sleeping room, with plans for more. He did much of the building himself over the weekends and evenings, with help from some of the men in town who contributed labor the way frontier communities contribute labor, because everyone understands that the man who needs a house built today is the man who will help you with yours tomorrow. Inez continued teaching through the spring term and finished the year with a school that had grown from 22 students to 29, new families having arrived in town as the territory continued to develop. The school board, which was composed of 3 businessmen and Theodore Cass, offered her a renewed contract for the following year with a salary increase, and she accepted, and came home from the meeting with a satisfaction in her face that Alfred thought was one of the finest things he had seen. She continued to teach while they built their life together, and Alfred admired this without reservation. He had grown up in an era when women's work outside the home was regarded with mixed feelings, but Daniel, characteristically, had been ahead of the curve on this, and whatever Daniel had been ahead of the curve on tended to eventually appear right to Alfred as well. More than that, watching Inez teach had shown him, concretely and specifically, what was lost when a woman of her ability and dedication was kept from work she was built for. The children of Silo Rojo were better off with Inez Keller teaching them, and the town was better for having a school that worked, and all of that was real and mattered. He loved her fully and without reservation, and the love had texture and specificity, not a general warmth but a detailed and particular knowledge of her. The way she held her coffee cup in both hands on cold mornings, the way she hummed without being aware of it when she was reading, the specific quality of her attention when she was genuinely interested in something, the way she argued with him when she disagreed, directly and with evidence and without making it personal, and then changed her mind if his evidence was better, which he had come to understand was rarer and more valuable than almost any other quality a person could have. He told her about Daniel sometimes, in the evenings on the porch of the adobe house, where they would sit after supper watching the sunset do improbable things to the Red Rock country. He told her stories about Daniel as a boy, the mischief and the energy and the absolute inability to stay still. Inez listened to all of it with her characteristic attention, and sometimes she told him things from Daniel's letters, things that gave Alfred a picture of his brother in that last year, planning a future, hopeful and purposeful in a way that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to hear. They had a habit, on Sunday mornings, of riding out to the higher ground east of the ranch, where you could see a vast sweep of the territory laid out below you, red and gold and impossibly wide. They would sit on their horses side by side and look at it, and Alfred would sometimes think about the road that had brought them here, the grief and the promise and the long ride south, and feel the particular gratitude of a man who has been given more than he bargained for by a situation that was supposed to be only loss. He kept Daniel's photograph, the one that had been in the original letter, the one of Daniel grinning in front of a Kansas fence, and he had framed it and put it on the mantel of the adobe house because it seemed right that Daniel should be present, that the house built partly from his generosity should have him in it. Inez had put flowers below it on the mantel, wildflowers from the desert she gathered on their rides, and Alfred thought that was exactly right. In the autumn of 1875, Inez told him quietly one evening that she was expecting a child. He sat with this information for a moment that he needed to be considerable, simply to absorb the scope of it, and then he looked at her with an expression that he suspected was not particularly dignified, but that was entirely genuine, and she looked back at him with the slightly nervous expression of someone who is very happy, but does not quite know what to do with how happy they are. "Inez," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, the way it does when emotion is running ahead of composure. "Sometime in the spring," she said. "April, perhaps. The doctor seems to think so." He crossed to where she was sitting and knelt down beside her chair, which he did not plan. It simply happened, and he took both her hands in his and looked at her face and felt the love he had for her expand to contain this new enormous thing. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you happy?" She laughed a little, that real laugh that he had been working to earn since December. "I am very well," she said, "and I am so very happy that I hardly know what to do with it." He brought her hands to his mouth and kissed them, both of them, which was not something Alfred Boone of the Kansas plains and the cattle drives would have recognized himself doing, but which felt entirely natural and correct. The winter of 1875 to 1876 was spent in the warmth of anticipation, the house taking on a quality of readiness as Inez made preparations, and Alfred built the second bedroom with a focused energy that the men in town found amusing in the way men find the preparations of expectant fathers amusing, affectionately and recognizing themselves in it. Helen Cass was a constant and capable presence, having raised 3 children of her own and being entirely willing to share everything she knew about the process with Inez, who listened and asked questions and absorbed information in the way she always did. Alfred watched Inez through those winter months with a love that had deepened again, the way a river deepens as it flows into bigger country. She was magnificent. That was the word that kept arriving, not in a grand or theatrical sense, but in the fundamental sense of a person rising to meet their life with everything they had. She taught until February, when the physical demands of the final months made it impractical, and the school was managed for those weeks by a temporary arrangement with a retired schoolmaster who had arrived in town the previous autumn and was glad of the work. She came home to the adobe house with a slight restlessness that Alfred understood was not unhappiness, but an active person's impatience with enforced stillness. And he did what he could, bringing her books from the general store and the lending arrangement Silo Rojo had developed, reading to her in the evenings from whatever she chose, talking with her about the children at school and the territory news and the ongoing large questions she liked to turn over, what it meant to build a community in a place this vast, what justice looked like in a land where the law was still finding its shape. The territory had complex and painful layers that they talked about honestly. The Apache and Navajo peoples who had been on this land for generations before any of the current settlers arrived, whose treaties were violated and renegotiated and violated again, with a consistency that Inez named clearly as injustice and Alfred agreed with, because it was injustice, plainly and without ambiguity. They did not pretend otherwise or soften it with the comfortable language that many settlers used. It did not mean they did not love the land or intend to stay, but it meant they looked at it clearly, which Alfred had come to believe was the minimum standard of decency. The boy was born on the 15th of April, 1876, in the adobe house on the ranch north of Silo Rojo, with Helen Cass serving as midwife and the doctor arriving slightly after the fact, which was the typical arrangement in places where births did not schedule themselves around doctor availability. Alfred was outside on the porch in the April night, cold and clear, for what felt like several geological eras, and when Helen Cass came to the door and said, "You have a son," he felt the world shift on its axis in a way that was entirely new. They named him Daniel Boone, which was both a tribute and a small family joke, since the original Daniel Boone of American legend was a name that had followed the family for a generation, and Alfred's Daniel had always found it either mortifying or amusing depending on his mood. Alfred thought this Daniel would find it amusing too, eventually. Inez nursed their son and recovered with characteristic efficiency, though Alfred insisted on the efficiency being somewhat slower than she would have chosen for herself, not because he doubted her, but because she was precious to him, and the lying-in period was the lying-in period for good reason. She submitted to this with tolerant amusement and an expression that suggested she was filing it for future reference. Little Daniel was a solid, curious child who looked, as he grew through the spring and summer, increasingly like a combination of his parents in unexpected proportions, Inez's dark eyes and Alfred's broader bone structure, with a disposition that seemed to belong to neither of them and entirely to itself. He was sociable and loud and interested in everything, which Inez said was not Daniel and not Alfred, but was simply who he was, which she seemed delighted by. Inez returned to teaching in the autumn of 1876, when Daniel was 6 months old. The school board had held her position, which Alfred thought spoke well of both the board and of the town's recognition of what she contributed. Little Daniel came with her on the days Alfred could not mind him at the ranch, and the students had by this point developed a proprietary affection for him that Inez sometimes described as both touching and occasionally inconvenient. The ranch grew steadily through 1876 and into 1877. Alfred added to the herd with care and knowledge, building slowly rather than expanding too fast, which was the mistake he had seen too many hopeful ranchers make in his cattle drive years. He hired a hand, a young Mexican man named Rafael who was 18 and strong and quick to learn, and the work of the ranch became a partnership that Alfred valued, not just for the labor but for the company of someone who was genuine and hardworking, and reminded him, sometimes, of himself at that age. Before the years of driving, cattle had worn some of the youth off him. He taught Raphael what he knew and treated him with straight equity, which was not universal practice in a territory where the hierarchy of ethnic groups was enforced with considerable social and sometimes legal pressure. Alfred had never had much patience for those hierarchies, having spent enough years in the company of every sort of man on the cattle drives to know that capability and character were distributed without reference to a man's origin, and he was not about to start deferring to them now. The summer of 1877 brought a drought that was difficult for everyone in the territory, the grass browning early and the creek running lower than Alfred had ever seen it. He made adjustments, moving the herd to the higher pasture where a spring still ran reliably, cutting his plans for the year and focusing on maintaining what he had rather than adding to it. It was a lean year but not a breaking one, and he came through it with the herd intact and the ranch in reasonable shape, which he counted as success given the conditions. Inez brought in the neighboring women during those hard months to talk about the drought, to share information and resources, and the gatherings at the adobe house had a practical and communal quality that Alfred admired. She had a gift for seeing where people needed connection and creating the conditions for it without making it seem like she was doing so, which was a much rarer gift than the more obvious kind. She was also, by the autumn of 1877, expecting their second child. She told him in the same quiet way she had told him the first time in the evening after supper, and he looked at her across the table and felt the same enormous thing arrive again, only this time mixed with the specific knowledge of what it meant, the first year of Daniel's life still vivid and warm in him. "Is the timing terrible?" she asked, because the drought year had tightened their finances and they were both aware of it. "The timing is exactly right," he said. "We will manage. We always manage." She gave him a look that was fond and slightly skeptical. "That is a very Alfred Boone thing to say." "I will take that as a compliment," he said. "It is one," she said, and reached across the table for his hand. Their second child was born in April of 1878, a girl this time, born with a quantity of dark hair and an immediate and assertive personality that made itself known within the first hour of her existence. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, and because it suited her somehow, clear and strong, which she was from the beginning. Daniel, who was 2 years old when Clara arrived, was initially uncertain about the new development, and then, within about 2 weeks, became so fiercely attached to his sister that keeping him from waking her became a significant household management challenge. Alfred found this deeply endearing and told Inez so, and Inez said, "He is entirely you in miniature," to which Alfred said he was not sure that was accurate, and she said, "Alfred, he sits outside her room and checks on her every half hour when she is sleeping. That is exactly you." Alfred thought about this and could not entirely argue with it. The life they built in Silo Rojo continued to grow and deepen through the late 1870s and into the 1880s. The town itself grew as the railroad's influence extended further into the territory, and with growth came the full complex business of a place becoming properly established, the politics and the commerce and the social negotiations that attend any community finding its shape. Inez was involved in all of it with the particular engagement of a person who cares both about the community and about doing things rightly, not just efficiently. She helped organize a library, working with several other women in the town to collect donated books and establish a lending arrangement in a back room of the general store until a proper building could be funded. She attended the town meetings and spoke at them when she had something worth saying, which was more often than the occasional discomfort of certain older men in the room suggested they would prefer. But the discomfort of older men at a capable woman's voice was a problem she had encountered before and managed with a combination of patience and absolute refusal to be made invisible. Alfred went to those meetings and sat beside her and occasionally observed, when someone was rude to her, that they might want to reconsider the tone, which he delivered with the flat calm of a large man who has learned that a certain quality of quietness is considerably more effective than volume. He was not a man who looked for confrontation, but he was not a man who permitted disrespect to the person he loved most in the world, and those two things in combination tended to resolve the situation adequately. He loved her more at 40 than he had at 28. That was something he had not known was possible, that love could keep getting larger without losing precision, that you could know someone so thoroughly and have the knowing be an enrichment rather than a diminishment. He knew her coffee preferences and her reading habits, and the particular way she went quiet when something was bothering her before she was ready to say it. And he knew that when she went that kind of quiet, the right response was to simply be present and not to pry, that she would come to the thing when she was ready, and she always did. They argued sometimes, because they were two people with strong views and genuine differences of opinion, and their arguments had over the years developed a shape that was, in retrospect, a kind of intimacy in itself, the particular architecture of how two specific people navigate disagreement when they love each other and take each other seriously. They fought fair and they resolved things, and there was never a night when the unresolved sat between them like a wall, because neither of them had the patience for that kind of damage. Raphael, who had worked with Alfred since 1876, became over those years something closer to a partner than a hired hand, as Alfred's trust in his judgment grew and Raphael's capability expanded. In 1882, when Alfred had built the ranch to a size that made partnership possible, he offered Raphael a share arrangement, a portion of the profits in exchange for a proportional stake in the work and decisions. Raphael was 26 years old by then, and he accepted with a seriousness that Alfred recognized as the seriousness of a man being offered something that he understood the full value of, not just the monetary value. They shook hands on it outside the barn in the autumn sunshine, and then Raphael smiled, which he did not do often, and Alfred clapped him on the shoulder, and that was that. Daniel Boone the younger started school in 1882 at his mother's school, which created a dynamic of notable complexity, as any child of the schoolteacher is aware. He was a bright boy with a particular gift for mathematics and an almost obstinate fairness of character that made him both popular with his peers and occasionally exhausting to the adults in his life, since his sense of fairness extended to pointing out adult inconsistencies with the relentless honesty of a child who had been taught to think clearly and had not yet learned why that is sometimes inconvenient. Clara started 2 years later, and where Daniel was steady and deliberate, Clara was quick and bold, 3 steps ahead of where she was supposed to be in every lesson, perpetually reading ahead in the primers and asking questions about things that had not been scheduled for this year. Inez taught both her children with the same even hand she used for all her students, which Alfred privately thought was one of the genuinely impressive things he had witnessed, the ability to be equally your children's teacher and their mother without letting the two things tangle. Alfred was 43 years old in the autumn of 1889, and the territory of New Mexico was on the verge of a significant change, statehood being discussed with increasing seriousness in the territorial legislature and in Congress, the long process of a place defining itself coming toward a particular threshold. The ranch had become a real enterprise by then, 300 head of cattle and a reputation for solid stock, a property that had gone from a speculative purchase to a genuine legacy. He rode it in the early mornings, in the hour before full light when the desert smelled of sage and cold stone, and he felt the particular satisfaction of a man who built something with his hands and his years, and is still in the building of it. He stopped sometimes on those morning rides at the rise above the creek where the view was widest, where you could see for miles across the red and gold country, and he thought about the chain of events that had brought him here. A letter soaked in blood, a dying brother's voice, a photograph of a woman with dark eyes and a lifted chin, a promise made in the seriousness of grief. He thought about Daniel often, and without the acute pain of the early years, the grief having transformed over time into something more like a permanent tenderness, a kept awareness of his brother's presence in the form of everything that presence had given rise to. The house and the ranch and the children and the life and Inez, most of all Inez, who had been a promise kept and had turned out to be the whole world. The photograph of Daniel still sat on the mantel in the adobe house, and the wildflowers below it had been replaced so many times over the years that they were more of a tradition than a memorial, a standing acknowledgement of what was owed. One evening in November of 1889, Alfred sat on the porch of the house he had built with the woman he loved and their son and daughter, Clara having come back from a visit to Helen Cass's ranch, where she had spent 3 days riding with the Cass grandchildren. The evening was cold and clear, the stars doing their perpetual spectacular work above the New Mexico desert, and the whole family was there, which was not always possible now that Daniel was 13 and Clara was 11, and both of them had the busy social calendars of children embedded in a community. Daniel was sitting on the porch steps with a book, which was his preferred configuration, and Clara was telling her mother about the horses at the Cass ranch with the focused enthusiasm of a child who had found her particular love. And Alfred sat in his chair with his coffee and his wife beside him and his children present, and the ranch quiet around them and the stars overhead. Inez reached over and put her hand over his on the arm of the chair. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They had the particular fluency of two people who have spent enough time together that the communication has gone past words into something more precise and less complicated. Alfred turned his hand over and held hers. He looked at her profile in the evening light, the dark hair now threaded with silver, the serious face with its familiar expressiveness, the eyes that still read him with the same clear attention they always had. He thought about the letter soaked in blood and the promise he had made. He thought about Georgia the roan mare and the long ride south through changing country. He thought about a white door in a small town and a woman in a doorway with dark eyes and a lifted chin. He had come to find her. He had not expected to fall in love on the way. He had not expected any of this, the life that had built itself out of grief and obligation, and turned out to be larger and warmer and fuller than anything he had ever planned for himself. He thought Daniel would have laughed. He thought Daniel would have said, exactly as Alfred had imagined that night in a Kansas boarding house 15 years ago, "Alfred, you idiot, why do you think I asked you specifically?" He thought that was probably right. "What are you thinking about?" Inez said quietly because she could tell he was thinking about something. "Daniel," he said, "both of them, all the Daniels." She squeezed his hand. "I think about him too," she said. "The one on the mantel, I am glad he brought you to me." "He would be very pleased with himself," Alfred said. Inez laughed softly, the real laugh that he had been working to earn since December of 1874 and had now had 15 years of hearing. "He would have been absolutely insufferable about it," she said. "He would have told everyone," Alfred agreed. They sat with the comfortable ghost of Daniel between them, not a sad ghost but a warm one, the presence of someone who was absent and also, in the most important ways, very much here. Clara had moved on from horses to wanting to know if they could get a dog, making her case to her mother with considerable logical force, citing responsibility and companionship, and the demonstrable benefit to children of having dogs, which she had apparently been reading about somewhere. Daniel looked up from his book. "She has been making that argument for 3 weeks, he told his father. "I know," Alfred said. "She is going to win," Daniel said, with the philosophical resignation of an older sibling. "Probably," Alfred agreed. Clara turned and looked at her father with the expression that was Inez's expression exactly, direct in reading him, and said, "Papa, the dog." Alfred looked at Inez. Inez looked at Alfred with an expression that said clearly that she was not going to make this particular decision alone, and also that she was not going to pretend to feel strongly about it. "One dog," Alfred said, "suitable for ranch work." Clara made a sound of triumph that startled a bird from somewhere in the juniper beside the house. Daniel returned to his book. Inez smiled. Alfred drank his coffee. The stars did their extraordinary and dependable thing above the New Mexico territory. In the years that followed, the Boone Ranch became something that might reasonably be called prosperous, not spectacularly so in the way of the great cattle barons further south, but solidly and sustainably so, the kind of prosperity that was built to last rather than to impress. Alfred and Raphael managed it together through the 1890s, through the fluctuations of the beef market and the occasional drought, and the complex politics of territorial governance that would eventually, in 1912, see New Mexico become the 47th state of the Union, though Alfred would be in his late 60s by then, and would sit on his porch with Inez and drink coffee, and say that it seemed about time. Daniel Boone, the younger, grew into a man who combined his parents' qualities in ways that were sometimes surprising and always admirable. His father's steadiness and his mother's quick intelligence. And after finishing his schooling in Albuquerque, he came back to the ranch and worked it alongside Alfred and Raphael, learning the cattle business from the ground up with the thorough attention that was his nature. He married a young woman named Esperanza Vega, a granddaughter of the Ernesto Vega who had ridden with Alfred and Inez to Silo Rojo all those years ago, which was a connection that gave Alfred and Inez both an enormous satisfaction, the sense of the long threads of a life weaving back together. Clara, true to the passion she had announced at 11, became a horsewoman of considerable skill, and eventually ran a horse breeding operation on the east side of the ranch property, having demonstrated to her father with characteristic Inez-style argumentation that horses were an entirely sensible business complementary to the cattle. She was right, as her mother tended to be about most things, and the two enterprises worked well together. She was also, by her mid-20s, entirely her own person in ways that made both her parents proud and occasionally required her father to sit quietly for a moment before responding. Inez taught school in Silo Rojo for 22 years in total, retiring from the classroom in 1897, when the school had grown large enough to require 2 teachers, and the town offered a suitable alternative candidate who needed the full-time position, and Inez was honest enough with herself to know that the time was right. She did not stop being involved in the school, serving on the board for years after, and continuing the library she had helped establish, which had grown from a back room into its own building by the turn of the century. She and Alfred had, between them, built something that neither of them could have built alone, which was perhaps the most accurate thing that could be said about it. They had built it out of unexpected things, a promise made to the dying, a long ride through changing country, the particular coincidence of 2 people finding each other when they were both in need of something real. On an evening in the spring of 1902, Alfred and Inez sat on the porch of the adobe house that had been added to and improved over 30 years, until it bore only the faintest resemblance to the original 2-room structure, though the original walls were still there at its heart, still solid. Daniel's photograph was still on the mantel inside, newer flowers below it from the garden Inez had planted along the south wall over the years. Inez was 52 and Alfred was 56, and the years sat on both of them in the way good years do, lightly, as wear rather than damage. Her hair was silver now, the dark of it transformed but the particular quality of her attention unchanged, still that specific clear focus that had been the first thing he had truly seen in her, across a table in Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house in Mesquite Wells, a lifetime ago. He looked at her in the spring evening light and felt the love that he had been feeling for 28 years, specific and detailed and large. Not a general warm feeling, but a precise and comprehensive knowledge of this particular woman, and a gladness, every time renewed, at the fact of her existence and his proximity to it. "What are you looking at?" she said, without turning, because she could tell. "You," he said. She turned and looked at him with the expression she had been giving him for 28 years, the one that was both fond and slightly exasperated and deeply warm, the expression that said she knew exactly what he was doing and intended to let him do it. "Daniel brought you to me," she said, as she had said before and would say again, because some things were worth saying more than once. "He did," Alfred said. "Best promise I ever kept." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat on the porch of the house they had built, in the town they had helped shape, in the territory that was still becoming itself, with the red rock country spread below the long evening sky, and the stars preparing, as they always did, to be extraordinary. He had ridden south from Kansas with a letter and a photograph and a promise made to a dying man. He had found her, as he had sworn he would. He had not expected, in the accounting of that promise, to find himself as well, to find his life and his home and the person who made sense of both. He had not expected love on the road south through the desert country. He had not expected any of it. He had gotten all of it anyway. That was the West for you. It gave you what it gave you, not what you came for. And if you were lucky, what it gave you was better than anything you had planned. Alfred Boone, cattle rancher, husband, father, keeper of promises, looked at his wife in the spring evening light and thought that he was, without question, and by a considerable margin, the luckiest man in the entire territory of New Mexico. Inez looked back at him with her dark eyes and her lifted chin and said, "Stop looking so pleased with yourself, Alfred." He smiled. "No," he said. She shook her head and looked back at the evening sky and squeezed his hand. And somewhere inside the house, their grandchildren, Daniel's first two, were making the kind of noise that grandchildren make, joyful and too loud and absolutely welcome. And the ranch was quiet around the edges of that noise. And the stars came out above New Mexico one by one, as they had done since before any of them were born and would do long after all of them were gone. Steady and brilliant and entirely indifferent to the small, beautiful fact that down below, on a porch in the high desert, two people were holding hands in the dark and were, in every way that mattered, exactly where they were supposed to be.